Hi, everyone. Welcome to Value First, the product-led sales podcast, a show where I interview product-led sales and growth leaders who share their secrets on how to grow revenue at product-led companies. Today, my guest is Sam Richard. Sam is the VP Growth at Openview, the leading expansion stage VC for product-led companies. She's a thought leader in the growth and product-led space, and also, most importantly, a legend at meme making. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Brad.
So for people who don't know what Openview is or your background, do you mind just starting with a little intro about yourself and what Openview is all about?
Yeah. So I'm based in Boston, built my career here. I started out very early in sort of marketing agencies and that type of work. I went in-house at a Boston-based company called Hourly Nerd at the time, and then moved very quickly to be the first marketer at a company called Dispatch. We sold into very large, like home services enterprises, like very antiquated businesses, very traditional models. But it was my task to onboard their third-party service providers. So tens of thousands of service providers. So imagine plumbers, electricians. I had to teach them how to use a mobile application and to use technology. So while I started out in marketing, I ended up owning a lot of customer success, support, and product strategy moving forward, because I was just like, it was really just a game of whack-a-mole of, how do we drive engagement with these audiences so that we can make money. So ultimately, we sold the business to Vista Equity Partners in 2018, and I stayed on for a bit, and then got a nice email from folks over at Openview Partners, which is a venture capital firm here based in Boston as well. It's a very highly curated firm. We only make investments in B2B software businesses at the expansion stage. So someone who has product market fit and who's really trying to figure out how to scale their marketing and sales, as well as their product. And we are all in on product-led growth. We actually coined the term back in 2017. And I work on our growth team. So we help portfolio companies and some of our top prospects with figuring out how to do go-to-market well. And I specialize in all things product-led. So I've been at Openview for going on 2 years now, and it's just super fun, and the role changes all the time. And I feel like I'm very, very lucky to have this bird's eye view of the software world.
Nice, amazing. We'll get to what Openview is looking in terms of startups, because I feel like a lot of listeners will be asking me, what does a VC, a big name VC like Openview looks for in startups? But I feel like we have to start with your meme game. It's not a typical question, but I'm a big fan of your memes. One of the recent one you posted was the horse one about growth hacks, and the fact that we'll put it on the screen, but I have to ask you a question about that. It's making fun of people who use growth hacks. Do you think that we're coming to the end of growth hacks, and where do you see that fit into the product-led motion, where it's a lot about building stable flywheels that are scalable? So I was just curious to get your point of view on, is it the end of growth hacks?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's the end of growth hacks, so to speak. I think that like the founder expectation that a growth person is just going to come in and find a growth hack that gives them enormous traction and turns them into like an Airbnb or a Dropbox of the world is garbage. And I think that those expectations are way too high. But I'm a huge fan of experimentation and constant iteration and failing quickly. I actually find that there are many folks who concentrate too much on building out scale before actually proving out that something works. So it's a balancing act. If you, especially in B2B software, because you don't have like massive audiences, so it's hard to really understand whether or not something's working. And sometimes it has to be intuitive. And you have to see like, oh, well, 5 more people in this group did something than the control group. So we actually do think this is working. We think this makes sense. And it's definitely more of an art than a science. And I think that people try and make it too much of a science because they've read stuff from folks at Facebook or from Twitter, things like that, where you have billions of people to experiment on. So it's definitely a balancing act. And I like to make fun of B2B software folks all the time, even though I'm one of them. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's good to be self-aware and to look at ourselves in the mirror. But I think that, I mean, product-led is a big space right now. It's very it's very sexy in a way. People are trying to ride that wave, but there's a lot of not fake product-led startups, but there's a lot of people who use the term
Yeah.
as for people using the AI term a couple of years ago. So this gets to the recent product benchmark report that you wrote with Kyle, and you talk a lot about product-led imposters. So would you mind sharing the biggest mistakes that you see product-led companies, both early stage and maybe later stage? What are the what can be an imposter syndrome in terms of product-led growth?
Well, I mean, it's hard, right? It's hard because a lot of people will just interpret product-led, meaning that someone can access the product for free. So they'll have a free trial or a free version. But usually, like if your product has been built so that sales or CS is really handling folks and you have this very personal flow, just opening it up doesn't mean that someone's actually going to get any value out of your product, your free product. Or they'll do something even trickier, which is like require a credit card at sign up for trial. Or I was recently filling out like a PDF editor that like let me do all of the stuff first, like fill out the entire PDF, but before I could download it, they
You
wanted to
had to
get
pay.
which
Yeah.
is so annoying. And like I call those like dark behaviors. And I almost feel like, you know, some of the KPIs and especially like the more traditional KPIs applied to software companies will actually encourage those habits. And we have to break ourselves of those habits. We have to say like, how can a user of this product actually get value of it from day one, rather than saying, how do we turn any given user of this product into a buyer of this product? And I think that's the real shift. And that's the real, those are the true imposters, are people who are looking at product led as a way to make a ton of money rather than a way to gather a lot of data on how they can improve their product itself.
Yeah, and you have to. I think we have to remember that the first step of product-led growth is building a great product.
Right.
You also did a meme about that recently. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
whether you have a free trial or freemium, if your product sucks, no matter like how you try to go to market, it won't work for product-led growth. What would you suggest, aside from starting to build on a great product? What would you suggest a company that's starting out, maybe in beta? I mean, we're early.
Yeah.
But in a company that's early stage, how would you start building a product-led motion or going in that direction?
Yeah, so I've actually been working on this really hard this half of the year. I've been talking to a lot of folks over at Calendly, SurveyMonkey, Trello about like their very early days and what that looked like. The one trend that I heard that I sort of seized on was that all of them just cared about user growth for the first 2 years. And it was weird that they all said 2 years, because that
Right.
seems like an eternity as a startup. But they were literally like, they were only measuring things in terms of user growth and in terms of user engagement and in terms of user retention. And I throw the word retention around and people think, oh, that's like monetary retention. No, it's saying like, did a person come back after the first day of using a product? Did they come back after a week? Did they come back after a month? And once you can really juice those numbers, then you can say, we're providing enormous value. And no matter what type of paywall we throw up, we do think that we'll have, 5 to 7% of folks converting on that paywall. And I think that there's a lot of temptation. People get into the software business, to make profit and those sorts of things. But the strongest companies that I've seen out there, the really outstanding ones, they started a business to capture an audience and to ensure that they were adding real value for that audience. So it's almost counterintuitive in a way.
Yeah, is that what you're looking for at the start as a VC in terms of engagement, retention versus revenue? Should that mean that an early stage startup can postpone revenue if they can, and focus on engagement and retention?
Absolutely. I mean, Openview switched to this because obviously the deal market in general has changed quite a bit. But
Yeah.
what we've always cared about is user retention. And is someone actually still getting value out of this product in 30 days? And we look at it on a cohort by cohort basis. So on a week to week basis, how many people sign up? but 4 weeks later, how many people from that exact week are still using the product?
Yeah.
And obviously usage is really subjective. Some people will do it as like monthly active, like just whether or not they've been seen in the product. Others will do it as like, have they taken a core action? So it's sort of up to our diligence teams to understand what that truly means. And it's something that I like to help portfolio companies and prospects struggle with as well.
Yeah, and I agree with that 100%. And I think one of the subjects that you're talking a lot about with product-led growth that I think we need to talk about is measuring, is measuring data and being able to understand data. How would you go about starting that motion, and which companies or which processes that you see from the best leading companies do in terms of measuring data? Because that could be really complicated. Sometimes an early stage company doesn't know where to start. Do I do basic dashboards? How do I integrate my data? Any tips for PLG companies out there?
My first tip is don't overthink it and don't overpay for it. I've met a lot of founders who think that they need like a PhD in data science to really take a look and understand these things. And I'm like, look, you have 500 users. Like, you could do this in Excel with an intern.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things to track, but when you really take a step back and look at your product, there are only a few key actions. So I actually do this with all of our portfolio companies. And the first group that I turn to is the support team and the sales team. And I say, look, like, what do you feel in your gut? Because they're not typically the most data-driven group. Like, what does your gut say is the most important action? And it usually sort of shakes out to be like 4 or 5. Sometimes it's like simple as adding a user. Sometimes it's like, connecting to a CI tool or something like that. And then I'll evaluate that and I'll see, are the vast majority of users actually taking this action? Because we want to see that there's a large group of folks who are actually doing it. Is it tied to business outcomes? So do the folks that actually do this, are they retained better by the product? Are they more likely to convert? Are they more likely to actually expand? And then, what are those users saying about that too? Like, when you ask them if they would take it away or those sorts of things, what is that response? And to me, it's relatively straightforward when you follow a framework, and I'm actually publishing that framework soon. So hopefully that comes out on the podcast.
Share it around as much
as so that way it just doesn't become this like huge activity. It's just isolating a few core things that you think that are going to be important to measure, and then actually measuring them and building your business around them. I find that, like, luckily, most folks have product analytics in place, but they're just measuring too many things and there's a lot of noise.
Yeah, I think that's super underrated in the space of focusing and diluting it down to the most important thing. Like, when we started, we were measuring a bunch of stuff, all the actions in the product, but I mean, it all comes down to what's the most impactful action people take that have actionable results onto either your retention and your engagement, and trying to understand, like, if I have to choose one metric, what's my North Star that I have to align the team. And I think going with an onion like structure of the first layer and then adding onto that, it's going to make your life way easier. You've mentioned sales earlier. Obviously, this is a product-led sales podcast. Blinks is a tool to empower sales teams for product-led companies. There's a big debate around sales at product-led companies. I think everyone's trying to figure it out. How would you see a company involving sales? Does PLG means no sales? Where do sales come in? Who owns growth in sales? Curious to get your thoughts on that, because it's obviously a space we're in, and I think people are still trying to figure that out. But we also see the biggest companies have investing heavily in sales, like Slack, Datadog, etc., hiring a ton of sales reps every year. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on sales at PLG companies.
Yeah, well, so I think my answer to this is two-pronged. I think the first is sort of the role of sales and the emerging role of sales. I think that if you're a very successful enterprise salesperson at Salesforce or something like that, you're going to really struggle in a product-led business, especially an early-stage product-led business, because your role is so much more than closing deals and like going out and finding deals. Your role is also bringing information back, curating it, and bring it back to product. Hopefully your product team is strong and has a lot of analytics, but I feel like those qualitative user stories and the value that users are getting from other somewhat adjacent tools and like what that user journey looks like and those sorts of things is something that a really good empathetic sales first hire is going to add an enormous amount to the team. And I've seen a lot of product-led businesses be brought down by hiring someone who's super senior at one of these like super blowout software companies. But the role is just really different. And honestly, as a first salesperson at a startup, you get beat up a ton anyway. So that's going to be a mismatch as well.
Yeah.
So just from hiring perspective, like hire young, hire hungry, hire empathy. From a like hiring perspective, or from a, you know, what we're seeing with Datadog and Atlassian, et cetera. The thing is, like, I think people are used to sales being really salesy and like reaching out immediately and those sorts of things. And I just think, you know, the answer is to slow your roll and to take a look at whether or not that person's actually finding value in the product. And if they're not, help them to find value in the product. They can get in the product. They don't need to be sold on the product. The website already did that. They're already in there. So help them to find value, help them to unlock that discovery, and then help them to understand how it can really work for their team. And that's when the sale happens, because most folks they really know how to use something as an individual, but they don't necessarily know how to advocate to bring something into the team that's working for them, or they don't know how to advocate to bring something into the organization that's working well for them. So the sales guy really needs to consider himself to be like their partner in this. A partner at Openview, Blake Bartlett, calls them sales Sherpas. You know, they're sort of helping you find the mountain. And I really like the terminology. So that's how I would define it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know about sales Sherpas, but I mean, in some of the blogs that I wrote, I talk about the consultancy aspect of sales for product-led companies and really working alongside your users. So really the dynamic shifts towards, you don't need to convince them of the value. They're already in your product or they've engaged with your marketing. It's about getting them to a stage and helping them walk towards either an expansion or some more value, or like you said, mitigate dealing with internal decision makers and everything that is required to expand an account or convert an account. What do you think are the biggest no-nos when it comes to sales reps at product-led companies? You talked about a guy coming from Salesforce, super salesy, right up front, pitching and try to convince people to pay. What do you think are big no-nos for sales teams in product-led companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first is really sort of blind outreach to everyone that's all the same. You know, I think that no matter who you are, if something feels like it's tailored to fit you, you're more likely to respond to it, even if it's with a no. And I think that sort of goes back to the empathy factor as well. And just not really taking anything into context. Like, I get so many, like, I mean, I sign up for like even public-led products, and I'm very disappointed by their sales outreach because they don't see that I work at like a venture capital firm. It'll be like a developer-focused tool, and they'll just like keep calling me, and those sorts of things. And it's just like, guys, like, there's no way that I'm actually an ideal purchaser of this product. Like, I'm using it to like take screenshots of your onboarding. So there's a lot of that too. It's just like, I almost call it like narrowing your funnel. So figure out the people who are not going to work for you, who are not going to be great fits. Don't reach out to them unless they start using the product in a way that reflects your very best users. And then for everyone else who could potentially be a great buyer of your product, push them along the journey in the way that your very best users have done so as well. So one of the first things we do at Openview is actually called a patient zero analysis. So we'll take the top 10% of accounts and we'll interview them. We will take a look at their data when they came into the product and like what that journey looked like. And then we sort of wrap that up. And then we have this like ideal journey that people should follow. And it's sales jobs to get them there until the product can do so itself.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think focus is really important in understanding that one size fits all first doesn't work for everyone. And you need to understand as a product-led business, which one do I ignore? Which leads do I automate up? And which leads do I involve sales in? And that's the which leads I involve sales in is kind of what we're trying to figure out. But it's a very interesting problem of how can sales prioritize? And on that, a lot of the talks around product-led sales is who owns what in terms of the functions in the company.
Mhm.
Who do you think should own growth and sales should, like, how would you build, if I'm an early stage company or I'm starting
Mhm.
to scale, how would you build your responsibilities internally and your processes, and who owns what in that process? Because we see CS sometimes taking sales responsibility, sales acting as CS, marketing merging with sales in terms of PQLs.
Mhm.
And you give a like beginner's guide in a very quick, like 1 minute, of how you would structure it.
Yeah.
I guess it changes on the stage of the business, but
It changes on the stage of the business, and I mean, to me, the core thing that I look for, when I'm talking to any startup is like, how compelling is this founder? How compelling is this team? And I was so lucky at Dispatch, and I've been so lucky at Openview to work with just a really strong team that you want to lean into their talents and you want to sort of detract away from their weaknesses or hire away from their weaknesses. So, I mean, I talk about this a lot. I recently published an article in TechCrunch in terms of growth and like there being different types of growth people. Like we're not all the same.
yeah,
And I think that there's growth folks who really focus on optimizing the product, or there's growth folks who really focus on getting as many people to discover the product as possible. Those are like the old school growth hackers. And then there are people who are focused on growth who are really great at like the levers of monetization. So like the pricing and packaging wizards, or the people who are really good at, figuring out how to build out a business op structure. I
yeah,
would say, really find your best skill, your best talent. The people who really understand your business and who are super passionate about it and who you see yourself in for like a 3 to 5 year, which is like now a long haul in startups, and build your business around that and what they can own, and then figure out, okay, what cannot be owned and who should own that instead.
yeah,
So if I had a growth person who was like very focused on optimizing the product, well, then I would say, okay, great. Well, I don't have to hire super commercialized PMs. I can hire PMs who are like really focused on just solving for those users' needs, who don't necessarily have to think about monetization or optimization because we're covered there.
yeah,
And then from a sales perspective, if I have that really curious and empathetic salesperson who's going to partner really well with product and growth, that's awesome. Then I don't necessarily need to hire a RevOps person as quickly. But ultimately, I'm going to want to hire a RevOps person to sort of be the interwebs between all of these different folks who bring all of these findings together and really sort of build the vehicles for this information to pass from one group another to another in that company. And one of the things that I'm seeing now is people hire RevOps too late. And I think a lot of it is because RevOps is a unicorn. People think of RevOps as like being BizOps or being sales ops.
yeah.
Um, but RevOps is really taking, inputs from the product, bringing them to marketing, taking inputs from the product, bringing them to sales, and bringing those learnings from marketing and sales and bringing those back to the product as well.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. I think data and data analytics is a crucial part of any product-led startup, and a lot of companies are making that mistake of not investing in it early. That doesn't mean that you need a RevOps person, or that doesn't mean that you need a complicated data analytics setting, but maybe implementing segments or connecting your tools together. I think silos can hurt businesses really quickly if you don't deal with them early. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
Last thing that I wanted to get your input on before I leave you alone. You're a very busy person. Before we do the famous five, what does a VC like Openview looks for in a startup? So
Yeah.
part of our listeners will be early stage startups that want to raise capital. What are you looking for in terms of companies that you want to invest in?
Well, I think the strongest thing is founder. And I'm not saying like a founder who's had like a ton of success. I think there's a lot of bias in the market towards founders who've been there, done that, but also founders who are resilient and who have shown that they can learn from, a thought partner like Openview, and who show that they listen and that they take inputs and they make really great decisions with them. And who will also be honest with themselves and say, hey, I'm in over my head. I really need an advisor. I think founder is really key. And, you take a look at like two very similar businesses. I look at like Stripe, as well as like their competitor at the time. I think it was Braintree. Like that founding team had grit, and they really thought outside the box. And I would invest in that founding team. They were like, what, 22 when they did it? So incredible.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, The next question was the non-business book, right?
I'm not into the quick questions yet.
Oh, okay.
I was just
Okay. Oh, it's still Openview.
yeah,
That's
open view,
changing a lot. It used to be highly revenue focused, but it's more about growth. So like how quickly are you growing really matters more to us than anything else. And then taking a double click and looking deeper into that growth, how healthy is that growth? So are
yeah,
people being retained? Is it, is the CAC payback period really long? Are you just buying that growth? Do you have a lot of money to buy that growth already? Uh,
yeah,
yeah, what are the levers of your growth and how sustainable are they is really the question. So those metrics tend to be like LTV, CAC, mostly CAC payback, CAC generally, and then really sort of like user retention and any revenue retention if you have some.
yeah. It's interesting. It's super cool to hear VC say founders at a late stage, because usually you hear like pre-seed invest in founders and then seed
Yeah,
in product and then late stage. But to hear you say founders at also a late stage is cool.
yeah.
Yeah, let's get into the 5 questions. As a respectable podcast host, I feel like I have to fit in with what everyone else is doing. So I'm going to shoot you like five quick
Okay.
fire questions and just answer them as fast as you can, and then
Mhm.
I'll leave you alone to your day. You ready?
All right. Yeah.
Great. Favorite non-business book that's applicable to business?
Um, I maybe this is a business book, but maybe I'm a nerd. I really like Disrupted. I
Yeah.
think it was meant to be as like a comedy. I think it was like tried to take some really cheap shots at HubSpot, but I ended up really admiring HubSpot after it, which might say more about me than anything. Especially like how marketing led the growth was and how experimental they were. They just like they were really ballsy. They would like put like non-existent product out there to see if people would get a bite. And I think that goes back to my admiration for experimentation, and for growing quickly, and trying to seize as much of the market as humanly possible. Like I think Dan Lyons really didn't like that approach and found it to be unethical, but I don't know, maybe that
Cool.
says more about me. Yeah.
What do you wish will happen in the tech space in the next 5 years?
There are a lot of things. I think more consolidation around the product-led tech stack. When I was an operator at Dispatch just 2 years ago, I was trying to hack everything into Salesforce,
Yeah.
and like luckily, like I know enough code to be like dangerous. It was like using like Lambda functions to like turn data into like actionable reports in Salesforce. I'm excited by this idea of like something that will actually take product data and give it back to sales and democratize data. I think that people talk a really big game about data, but no one actually really uses it to make everyday decisions at like the frontline level. And the people who do are really, really amazing. So I'd like to see more of that, especially in business software.
Nice. That's what Blink's
Yeah.
trying to solve. So I'm glad
Yeah.
you answered that. Which CEO founding team do you look up to and why?
Oh, that's a really good question. I am a very stoic person, but I actually really cried when I saw the CEO of Bumble take her 1-year-old son to ring the bell at the IPO. That was a really
Yeah.
big deal for me. So, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
What's the most underrated tool, growth technique, or skill for sales in your opinion?
I think tenacity, and being a farmer rather than a hunter for me is the most underrated skill. Someone who's actually willing to cultivate a relationship and to revisit it and to like give back when you don't necessarily have an immediate ask from them is a really big deal. And I think that that's what I put my career on. And I didn't realize I was doing it at the time, but I've been very lucky to make the connections that I have.
Yeah, totally agree. Something you wish you knew when you were 20?
Um, Career paths are not linear. I was always the A+ student. I was the oldest child. I've always been neurotic. And I thought that I should have my whole life planned out by the time I was 20. And if you had told me I was working in venture capital, I would have said, what the hell is that? So yeah, career paths are not linear, and do what feels right for you at the time.
That's great advice. Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sam. I really enjoyed the conversation with you. I think the listeners will get a lot of value from it. If people want to reach you or Openview, what's the best way?
LinkedIn is the best. I am actually going on parental leave at the end of October, so you may not get a response from me, but you will eventually because I like people. LinkedIn is the best, or you can just email me directly at sam@ov.vc.
Amazing. Well, Sam, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. and we'll talk soon. Have a great one.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad.
Bye.